You know what nobody tells you when you first get into woodworking? That you are going to spend more money on clamps than you ever spent on saws. I am not exaggerating. I added it up one afternoon, and between the pipe clamps, the parallel clamps, the spring clamps, and all the little specialty clamps I have picked up over the years, I had well over $1,000 just in clamping equipment. And half of them were hanging on the wall collecting dust. Then, about 3 years ago, I was reading about traditional Japanese cabinet makers, the Sashimono craftsmen who built furniture in Edo period Tokyo. And I noticed something strange. In all the old workshop illustrations, there were almost no metal clamps anywhere. These guys were building incredibly precise furniture, tight joints, flawless panels, and they were doing it with small wooden wedges and a flat surface. I thought there is no way that actually works for a serious glue-up, but I tried it, and I am not going back. Today I am going to walk you through exactly how Japanese craftsmen use simple wooden wedges to generate real clamping pressure, and how you can set up the same system in your shop for about $5 in materials. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will show you a trick for getting even pressure across a long-edged joint that I have never seen in any American woodworking book. Let me get into it. This is one of those techniques that sounds too simple to be real until you actually try it. Japanese wedge clamping is a complete system for applying controlled, even pressure using nothing but wood against wood. And once you understand the principle behind it, you start realizing just how much money most of us are spending to solve a problem that was solved centuries ago with a scrap of hardwood and a mallet. So let me give you some background on where this comes from, because the context matters. The Sashimono tradition in Japan goes back to at least the 16th century, and it reached its peak during the Edo period, roughly 1600 through 1868. These were urban craftsmen, mostly in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo, and in Kyoto. They built everything from tansu chests to writing desks to tea ceremony utensils. And here is the key thing to understand. Metal was expensive in Japan for most of this period. Iron and steel were reserved for swords, tools, and agricultural implements. You did not waste iron on clamps. So Japanese woodworkers developed an entire approach to assembly that relies on wooden wedges pressed against fixed points, usually the workbench itself or a heavy plank with stops nailed or pegged into it. They used a wood called akagashi, which is Japanese red oak, for their wedges because it is extremely hard, has a tight grain, and resists crushing. But the principle works with any dense hardwood you have on hand. Hard maple and white oak are perfect substitutes in a North American shop. The philosophy behind this is the same philosophy behind most Japanese woodworking. Use the minimum tool for the maximum result. Do not add complexity where simplicity will do, and trust wood to do what wood does, which is grip, compress, and hold under pressure. That philosophy saved them money centuries ago. It can save you money right now. Let me start with the core principle, because once you understand why this works, the rest of it just falls into place. A wooden wedge is really just an inclined plane. When you drive a wedge sideways between two fixed points, a small amount of force from your mallet gets converted into a much larger amount of lateral pressure. The mechanical advantage depends on the angle of the wedge. A steep wedge, say 15 degrees or more, gives you less mechanical advantage but moves faster. A shallow wedge, around 5 degrees, gives you enormous pressure but requires more tapping to get it seated. Japanese cabinet makers settled on a sweet spot of about 7 to 10 degrees for most clamping work. At that angle, a moderate tap with a small mallet generates roughly the same pressure as a mid-range bar clamp tightened by hand. I did not believe that until I tested it myself. I set up a simple glue joint, used a fish scale to measure the force at the joint line, and compared it to one of my $35 parallel clamps. The wedge setup at 8 degrees produced within about 10% of the same reading for a piece of scrap maple that cost me nothing. The other thing that makes this work is that wood has natural friction. Unlike a metal clamp where the screw can back off if you bump it, a wooden wedge driven against another piece of wood stays exactly where you put it. The grain-on-grain friction locks it in place. It will not creep, it will not slip, and it will not lose pressure while your glue sets. That is the foundation. Now let me show you how to actually build a set. You need 3 things: wedge stock, a clamping batten, and fixed stops on your bench. For the wedge stock, take a piece of hard maple or white oak about 12 inches long, 2 inches wide, and 3/4 of an inch thick. On your table saw or with a hand plane, taper one edge so the piece goes from 3/4 of an inch at the thick end down to about 1/8 of an inch at the thin end over those 12 inches. That gives you roughly a 7-degree angle, which is right in the sweet spot. Now cut that tapered piece in half lengthwise so you end up with 2 matching wedges, each about 1 inch wide. Those are your opposing wedges. You always use them in pairs, thin end to thick end, facing opposite directions. When you tap one wedge against the other, the pressure goes perfectly sideways, straight into your workpiece, with no angular force that could push things out of alignment. For the clamping batten, you just need a straight piece of hardwood, about 2 inches wide and 3/4 of an inch thick, cut to whatever length your workpiece requires. This sits between the wedges and your workpiece to distribute the pressure evenly, just like a caul. For the fixed stops, if your bench has dog holes, you can use regular bench dogs. If it does not, you can drill 3/4 inch holes in a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, about 2 feet by 4 feet, and use short dowels as stops. Some of the traditional Japanese setups just used hardwood blocks nailed directly into a thick work plank. The whole setup, a couple of wedge pairs, and a plywood clamping board with some dowels, cost you about $5 in materials, maybe less if you are using offcuts from your scrap bin. I made my first set in about 20 minutes, and I have been using the same wedges for nearly 3 years now. The maple has barely shown any wear. Now, if this kind of traditional knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Kenji's Workshop. It covers 100 ancient Eastern woodworking secrets that modern craftsmen have forgotten. The kind of stuff you will not find in most woodworking books today. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. Here is where this system really starts to shine. Edge glue-ups. This is the job most of us reach for bar clamps or pipe clamps to do, and it is the job where those clamps cause the most headaches. You know what I mean. You tighten one clamp and the boards slide vertically. You add another clamp on the bottom to counteract it, and now your whole panel is bowing. You end up using 6 or 8 clamps on a simple 2-board joint, alternating top and bottom, trying to keep everything flat. The Japanese approach is completely different. You lay your 2 boards on a flat surface, your bench top or that plywood clamping board I mentioned. You put a fixed stop on one side, snug against the edge of the far board. On the other side, you place your batten against the near board and then your wedge pair between the batten and another fixed stop. One tap on the wedge, and both boards are being pressed together with even lateral pressure. The boards cannot ride up because gravity and the flat surface are holding them down. There is no vertical force component at all because the wedges are driving straight sideways. When I did my first edge glue up this way, I used 2 wedge pairs spaced about 8 inches apart on a 24-inch panel. The result was a perfectly flat, perfectly tight joint. No bowing, no sliding, no fiddling with clamp heads. For longer panels, say 36 inches or more, just add a 3rd wedge pair in the middle. Each wedge pair costs you nothing and takes up no storage space. You are not buying another $40 clamp every time your project gets a little wider. Once I saw how well this worked for edge joints, the next thing I tried was frame and panel assembly, and this is where the method gets really clever. Say you are gluing up a door frame, 4 pieces of wood with mortise and tenon joints at the corners. Normally you would use at least 2 bar clamps going one direction and 2 more going the other direction, and you would spend 10 minutes getting everything square and making sure the clamps are not racking the frame. With the wedge system, you set the assembled frame on your flat clamping surface. You place fixed stops along two adjacent edges, forming an L shape. Then on the opposite two edges, you place battens and wedge pairs. When you tap the wedges, pressure goes inward on both axes simultaneously. The frame pulls tight in both directions at once. And here is the part that really surprised me. Because the pressure is coming from flat battens, bearing against the full length of each rail and stile, the force is distributed so evenly that the frame self-squares. There is no point load from a clamp head trying to twist things out of alignment. I tested this with a small cabinet door, about 14 inches by 20 inches, with quarter-inch tenons in cherry. I set the whole thing up, tapped 4 wedge pairs, checked it with a combination square, and it was dead square on the first try. That almost never happens for me with bar clamps. If the frame is not perfectly square, you just tap one wedge pair a little harder than the other to adjust. You have individual control over every pressure point, which is something even expensive parallel clamps cannot give you. Now let me share the application that really changed my thinking: irregular shapes, curved pieces, odd angles, repair work where you are patching a section of an old piece. This is where conventional clamps completely fall apart. You cannot get a bar clamp around a curved leg. You cannot get even pressure on a diamond-shaped patch. But wedges do not care about shape. You can cut a custom clamping block that matches any curve in about 2 minutes on the bandsaw. You hold it against the workpiece, put your wedge pair on the other side, and drive it home. I used this method last winter to repair an old rocking chair where a piece of the arm had split away. The curve of the arm made it impossible to clamp conventionally. I cut a little cradle block from a piece of poplar that matched the outside radius, set up opposing wedges against a stop I clamped to my bench, and got perfect pressure right along the glue line. The repair is invisible. You can also use this for veneering curved surfaces. Lay your veneer on the curved substrate, set up wedge pressure through a flexible caul, and the pressure follows the curve naturally. No vacuum bag needed, no complicated form, just wood pressing against wood. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I would like to admit. The first pattern is buying more clamps to solve clamping problems. Every time a glue-up went wrong, my instinct was to add another clamp. More pressure, more control, right? But the Japanese approach showed me that the problem was never the amount of pressure. It was the direction and distribution of pressure. 2 well-placed wedge pairs often do more than 6 badly placed bar clamps. The second pattern is accepting point loading as normal. Most clamps apply force through a small pad, maybe 2 inches wide. We compensate with cauls, but how many times have you skipped the caul because you were in a hurry? Wedges pressing through a full-length batten give you even pressure by default. You do not have to add a caul. The batten is the caul. The third pattern is tolerating creep and slip. I cannot count how many glue-ups I have had where a board shifted while I was tightening the last clamp. We accept it, clean up the offset with a hand plane afterward, and move on. But wedge clamping applies pressure gradually and evenly, with no sudden jerking force. Nothing moves unless you tap a wedge. You have complete control over the speed and direction of pressure. The fourth pattern is spending money on a problem that scrap wood can solve. I'm not saying you should throw away all your clamps. There are situations where a parallel clamp or a quick grip is the right tool. But for 80% of the glue-ups I do in my shop, wedges work just as well or better, and they cost me essentially nothing. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one is specifically about getting even pressure on a long edge glue up. and it is a technique I have never seen in any American woodworking book. Traditional Japanese craftsmen would sometimes apply a very slight convex curve to their clamping battens, just a few thousandths of an inch over 2 feet. You can do this with 3 or 4 passes of a hand plane along the middle of the batten. What this does is ensure that when the wedges drive the batten against the workpiece, the pressure hits the center of the joint first and then spreads outward toward the ends. This counteracts the natural tendency for pressure to concentrate at the ends, which is what causes those hairline gaps you sometimes see in the middle of a long-edged joint. I started doing this about 2 years ago, and I have not had a single open joint since. It takes 30 seconds to add that slight crown to the batten, and the difference in joint quality is remarkable. You do not need a measuring tool for this. Just take a few light passes with your number 5 plane down the center third of the batten, check it by rocking the batten on a flat surface, and when it just barely rocks, you are there. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best ancient Eastern woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called Kenji's Workshop. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next one.